Presiden Joko Widodo kembali mendapat kritik tajam. Kali ini peneliti asal Australia Ben Bland dalam bukunya memberikan banyak catatan atas kepemimpinan Jokowi. Buku karya Ben Bland pun menimbulkan lumayan cukup banyak keriuhan, tidak hanya menyangkut judul dan isi buku, tapi tentu saja terkait dengan beragam tanggapan atas hadirnya buku tersebut. Keberadaan buku berjudul Man of Contradictions, Joko Widodo and the Struggle to Remake Indonesia menjadi sebuah upaya dalam menafsirkan arah kepemimpinan Jokowi di antara program pembangunan dan tekanan partai politik. Disebut Man of Contradictions, sejauh mana kepemimpinan Presiden Jokowi dikritik dalam buku peneliti asing ini. Insight akan membahasnya bersama saya, Desi Anwar.
Kritik sejatinya merupakan masukan yang wajar untuk saling mengingatkan. Namun kritik, ibarat pedang, bisa berguna atau menjadi malapetaka, tergantung kita menyikapinya. Kritik lumrah menerpa para pemimpin bangsa, baik dari dalam maupun luar negeri.
Saya paham masih banyak tantangan.
Presiden ke-7 Republik Indonesia, Joko Widodo, tentu tak lepas dari kritik. Kepemimpinannya di era keterbukaan informasi dan kemudahan akses komunikasi saat ini kerap menimbulkan argumentasi. Tahun pertama pada periode kedua Jokowi menjabat, sejumlah lontaran kritik susul menyusul seiring dengan kebijakan Jokowi dalam menangani pandemi. Pada awal Februari lalu, Jokowi beberapa kali menjadi sasaran kritik media asing. Saat itu, The New York Times melaporkan bahwa pakar kesehatan mempertanyakan kebenaran Indonesia yang belum melaporkan satu kasus pun. Sedangkan negara tetangga seperti Malaysia dan Singapura sudah mencatat kasus pertama pada akhir Januari. NYT pun menyoroti kekacauan informasi yang disampaikan oleh pemerintah dan influencer. Ada juga SBS News, The Sydney Morning Herald, dan The Guardian yang juga mempertanyakan kebijakan pemerintah Indonesia dalam perang melawan virus corona. Tak hanya itu, kritik untuk Jokowi muncul pula dalam catatan peneliti Australia Ben Bland. Bukunya, Man of Contradiction, Joko Widodo and the Struggle to Remake Indonesia menyebut Jokowi menyembunyikan informasi tentang pandemi dan bimbang antara mengambil tindakan mitigasi yang diperlukan atau menyarankan tidak ada yang perlu dikhawatirkan. Tentu saja, kritik dari pihak asing dewasa ini bukan lagi menjadi hal yang tabu dan mengganggu. Kritik dapat menjadi pemantik agar seseorang menjadi lebih baik.
Ya, berbagai kebijakan Presiden Jokowi dari penanganan terhadap virus corona hingga rencana kepindahan ibu kota dikritik dalam buku karya peneliti Lowy Institute Australia Benjamin Bland. Ben menyebut pemerintah Indonesia menunjukkan banyak sifat terburuknya seperti mengabaikan nasihat ahli, kurangnya kepercayaan pada masyarakat sipil dan kegagalan untuk mengembangkan strategi yang saling bersangkut paut. Untuk mengetahui lebih lengkap mengenai Man of Contradictions, Joko Widodo and the Struggle to Remake Indonesia, saya sudah bersama Ben Bland, sang penulis yang juga sebagai direktur dari program Asia Tenggara di Lowy Institute Australia. Ben saat ini berada di Sydney. Hello Ben.
Hi, Desi.
Hai, how's everything? Apa kabar? Masih bisa bahasa Indonesia kan?
Yeah, baik-baik saja. Yeah, not too bad here in Australia, but looking forward to things getting back to normal here and in Indonesia too, so I can hopefully come back and visit soon.
Yeah, but you haven't been back for a year and a half. But altogether, you've been to Indonesia, and you have been in Indonesia for quite well, haven't you, Ben? How many years altogether?
I lived in Jakarta for more than 4 years as a correspondent for the Financial Times, and previously as well working at the Jakarta Globe. And after I left, I was a regular visitor, coming, several times a year from Hong Kong before, and then from Sydney until the pandemic hit, which obviously made it impossible to travel now.
Yeah, so you're quite familiar with Indonesia. Congratulations on your new book. I see it on the back on your shelves, Man of Contradictions, and it's interesting. I mean, it's think I read it in like just a few hours. It's less than 150 pages. And I think if we're talking about Indonesia, obviously it cannot reflect the complexities of what this country is in such a short space. And also when it comes to leadership, I see that you have been following Joko Widodo since he was a mayor in Solo until he became president and up to the present day, 2020. Just out of curiosity, Ben, who do you have who's your target audience, really? I mean, and what would you like for your reader to get out of this book, both about Jokowi as a president and about Indonesia as a country?
It's a great question, and for me, it's really a book, for the most part, for outsiders, for people who don't know anything about Indonesia. So as a writer, just like as a journalist before, I think you have to have in mind, the average person who's interested in the world, but maybe doesn't know much about Indonesia. So I really had this challenge of trying to tell the story of Jokowi from scratch, his political rise, his leadership, and put it in the context of Indonesian politics, Indonesian history, for people who might not be very familiar. And at the same time, I also wanted my book to be useful for experts, for policymakers, for business people who are trying to get a better handle on Indonesia. So it's quite challenging to cover all those bases, but I did my best, and I hoped as well at some point it might be interesting for Indonesians too to see how outsiders see them. But really, I'm writing for people who don't necessarily know much about Indonesia in the first place, trying to explain things from first principles, which I think is a really helpful way to approach a subject, actually, because it forces you to question your own assumptions.
Mm-hmm. And how is the book doing? Is it selling quite well? Is there a great interest in Australia so far?
It's concerning publishing a book about Indonesia, because publishers will always tell you that no one cares about Indonesia, which is really frustrating for someone who loves the country and cares about it deeply. But I've been really pleased to see that even in this difficult time, in the midst of a pandemic, that it's doing well in Australia. The first 3 print runs have sold out. I'm hoping it's going to be distributed further into Southeast Asia. There's been a lot of interest in Indonesia and Australia, but also in places like Singapore, even in Europe and the US. So it's really heartening to see at this difficult time. And I think people do want to know more about Indonesia, but the challenge is there's so much ignorance outside that you're starting from a low base. But if you don't write more, if we don't engage more, then people will never have more interest. So it's a kind of chicken and egg problem. And in my very, very small way, hopefully I'm contributing to helping people understand the country a little bit better and having more enthusiasm to go there, go on holiday, go and invest, learn more about Indonesia.
Yeah, well, it's certainly, we're always very appreciative when books about Indonesia is written and read by, particularly our neighbor, Australia, because it would help in clarifying some of the mysteries of what Indonesia is all about. But you said that it's a political biography of President Jokowi. My impression, and of course, if it's to get Australians to understand more about Indonesia and about the man, I'm sensing sort of a negativity here, even in the title, Man of Contradictions. I presume that's not a positive thing to be, And the other thing, it's about Indonesia itself. Obviously, the leader is very much a reflection of the country itself. So what is it exactly? Are you here trying to give an honest political biography about the man, or is it more sort of a critical assessment of his leadership and about the country in general?
Well, Desi, I don't really agree with your characterization of contradictions as a negative idea. What I'm arguing, in a sense, is that all human beings and all leaders, to some extent, are contradictory. I think Jokowi, and we can talk about why, is particularly contradictory. But contradiction implies a good side and a bad side. It implies these different forces, yin and yang, if you like, at play. So that's what I'm trying to get people to understand, is the complexity, the tension, partly of the leader, of the president, and also some of the long-running tensions in Indonesian history that I think Jokowi and some of the challenges he faces reflect. So I don't think it's negative at all. It's actually trying to get people to embrace complexity, because too often I think when outsiders look at Indonesia or many other emerging countries, they tend to have very simplistic labels for what's going on. And I think that that doesn't really get to the heart of the matter. So I'm pushing people to engage with the complexity, engage with the contradictions. And I think that's really what my book is pushing for. It's not meant to be negative. It's meant to be quite sympathetic, actually, as a portrayal of a man who came from very simple beginnings, who climbed his way to the top of the political system because of his connection with voters, his focus on hard work, on getting things done. But of course, leading a country of 270 million people is a hard thing. And I'm trying to get people to engage with some of those challenges and present a portrait that's actually sympathetic to the difficulties of leading Indonesia.
Okay, so sympathetic portrayal, man of contradictions, is not a portrayal of, wishy-washiness or inconsistencies in a negative light. But we'll take a quick break, Ben, but I would like to get more about this contradictions aspect, what it is about him and about Indonesia that you find contradictory. So we take a little break, and I will be back with you in a minute. Tetaplah bersama kami, Insight with Desi Anwar akan segera kembali. Inside with Desi Anwar masih bersama Ben Bland, penulis buku Man of Contradictions, Joko Widodo and the Struggle to Remake Indonesia. Ben bergabung bersama kita lewat Zoom langsung dari Sydney. Ben, so thank you for correcting me. Man of Contradictions not supposed to be a negative or a criticism, but more sort of a sympathetic outlook on somebody who had risen as from furniture maker to become a president, which is absolutely an extraordinary feat, and one of the reasons why President Jokowi, particularly in the beginning of his presidency, was an inspiration to many in Indonesia and also around the world. I would like to just quote what you said, though. I would watch the Jokowi phenomenon grow exponentially before crumbling under the burden of expectation. Certainly, disappointment in your tone.
I think it's not necessarily my disappointment, but I'm trying to reflect that this is one of the great tensions or contradictions, if you like, of Jokowi, that for many of his strongest supporters in Indonesia, in the civil society organizations, many of the relawan, the volunteers who helped him rise to the top, especially in the 2014 election, as well as for many outsiders in the business community and NGOs and the foreign governments. I think they saw Jokowi as this great reformer, a new broom who would sweep away the red tape, the bureaucracy, the corruption, the old way of doing things. And yet, as a leader, he's a much more incremental figure who actually works with the established power structures. And he does try to push change, but I think in incremental ways, bit by bit. He's not someone who wants to try and transform the whole system. So I think the disappointment comes because people's hopes were elevated so high, partly because of Jokowi's backstory. I think people read a lot into him. I mean, one of Jokowi's advisors told me during my research that a bit like some other leaders, he presented himself as a bit of a blank canvas who allowed other people to paint their hopes and dreams onto him. And that's a great political talent, right? To allow people, whether it's the kaki lima owners or international business people or NGO workers in Indonesia, to see what they want in you. That's a great political skill, but I think the great hope that there was has led to inevitably some disappointment, because a man who came from these humble beginnings has proved also to be a consummate elite transactional politician. So Jokowi is very good at doing the elite politics and maintaining political stability. But the question is, has he really pursued those deep reforms that some people hoped he would see? So for me, that's one of the many contradictions. And this, I should explain, this idea of contradictions actually came from someone who worked with Jokowi. And as I was struggling to try and find a way to kind of frame his leadership, to explain it to outsiders, one of his advisors told me, well, look, Jokowi is actually a bundle of contradictions like Indonesia. And then he explained a number of ways in which that was the case. So this idea really came from those who work with him, who find him exciting, exhilarating, has a lot of potential. But of course, he, like other leaders before him, comes up against these fundamental problems. And I just think it's fascinating to see how this guy has come from nowhere, he's come to the top, and he's really transformed into, as I say, a brilliant player of elite Indonesian politics, with now 3/4 of the DPR behind him. But what's happened to that transformational change? Of course, you can't have transformational change if you're trying to bring all the political parties alongside with you.
Yeah. So, Ben, since 1998, when we have the Reformasi, I mean, Indonesians, we've been blessed with democratically elected leaders, certainly more democratic than under the new order. And we've gone through a series of high expectations every time at the beginning of election. We saw it in President Yudhoyono's, and actually he was elected with a much higher mandate than Jokowi in 2014, and that also ended up in disappointment. Would you say that this is more a reflection on the contradictory nature of Indonesia as a country, and he is basically sort of, sucked into that? Because, like I said, one of the problems of Indonesia, it's not only so much the contradictions in itself, but the inability to implement any of its, much of its, ideas, plans, and campaign promises, and what have you.
I think it's to a certain extent, Jokowi does reflect these contradictions, which I think, date back to Indonesia's founding. And Indonesia, in global terms, is a young nation, 75 years young, which has come through a lot. It's done an amazing job. But there are still these fundamental questions, if you like, or tensions, between democracy and authoritarianism. We're only in really the second phase of democracy in Indonesia after, a long period of authoritarian rule in the middle, but also tensions between Islam and pluralism, between openness on the economy and protectionism. And these contradictions really date back to the founders of Indonesia in 1945 and the debates around how the country should be organized. And in many cases, those debates continue today, not because people have been bad at resolving them necessarily, but just because these are really difficult questions, I think, for any government to answer in a young country about who holds power, how is power used, for whose benefit, what's the makeup of the state going to be. When you're a country of 270 million people spread across such a vast area, so many different ethnic groups, religions, these are difficult questions and they take time to resolve. And I actually think Indonesia has definitely been moving in the right direction, but it's not easy. So Jokowi has faced similar challenges, although what I find fascinating is while many of Jokowi's civil society backers and some foreign experts are very disappointed, he remains remarkably popular. If you look at the opinion polling data recently, Jokowi's getting very good scores for his leadership, high approval ratings. People trust him to bring Indonesia through the coronavirus crisis. So that's very different from Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, where we did see he became increasingly unpopular in his second term, even though, as you say, he won by a landslide. So that's another one of the contradictions, if you like, about Jokowi, this great disappointment that we see from many of the activists to his strongest supporters. But actually, for many Indonesian voters, he remains a remarkably popular leader, which is an achievement, I think, for any leader in any system in the world, to be so popular into your second term, especially in the midst of such a difficult crisis.
Which is interesting because Jokowi has another 4 years under his belt. I'm just curious about your timing, Ben, writing about sort of a political biography of an incumbent. What's the thought behind it? And just out of curiosity.
Well, it's much more difficult to do while someone's still in office. It would have been far easier for me to wait until 2026 or 2028. Historical documents and judge the president once his term in office is over. But I work for a think tank. I want to help policymakers. I want to help other people understand Indonesia and the region around Australia. And so I wanted to provide a guide that would help people make sense of the leader in the country while he still has time in office. So it's actually a useful tool. But of course, the flip side of that is it's an unfinished story. I accept that, but I think it's more useful this way. And I also really wanted, with such a short book, to spark more interest from other people, from Indonesians in particular, but also other outsiders, to write more, to think more about Jokowi and his leadership and the historical context that he's dealing with, because I think it's interesting for people to know more and write more and think more about these questions.
Yes, of course, and a lot of things can happen until 2024, obviously. But Ben, feedback. Have you heard anything from the palace or from Jokowi? Like as you rightly mentioned, he has his very staunch supporters. What's reactions been like to your paper?
I haven't had any direct feedback, but indirectly from looking at social media, seeing coverage in the Indonesian press, I think there's a lot of interest, which is nice. I mean, I previously wrote a book about Hong Kong, where I used to live, and again, I wasn't claiming that as an outsider I know more than the people of Hong Kong, or certainly, of course, the people of Indonesia. But I think people are interested to see how those outside the country see them. It's a different comparative lens, so there has been a lot of interest. I think I've had good reviews in Tempo magazine and other places, which is really nice to see. Of course, there's some politicization. The really strong supporters, have criticized some things, but I don't think those people have read the book, which hasn't gone on sale in physical form yet in Indonesia. So I'd urge people just to read the book for themselves and make up their own mind. And I think my philosophy has always been through writing is to try and provoke debate and discussion, because I think that's how we get a better understanding and move forward. And I totally accept not everyone will agree with everything I have to say, but if I'm driving and helping to drive the conversation, then I think that's great.
Ben, but we will be back in just a few minutes. Jadi jangan kemana-mana dulu. Insight with Desi Anwar akan segera kembali. Iya, masih bersama Insight with Desi Anwar. Saya ditemani dengan Ben Bland. Ben Bland adalah penulis buku Man of Contradictions, Joko Widodo and the Struggle to Remake Indonesia. Buku ini masih baru beredar di Australia dan belum bisa dibeli di Indonesia. Tapi sepertinya sudah cukup banyak ya orang di Indonesia membacanya. Ben, one of the things that obviously now COVID-19 is what we're talking about, and you're particularly critical in the way that Jokowi's government is handling the COVID-19. You mentioned the complete disregard for expert advice, a lack of trust in civil society, and a failure to develop a coherent strategy. COVID-19 is actually an interesting way for us, globally, to see how leaders respond to a crisis, to a pandemic. And, we see it in the United States, for example, and we've seen China dealing with it. We've also seen, of course, the way Indonesia deals with it. Is it a fair assessment of would you say, you're being fair, that there is a lack of strategy, given that very few leaders in the world seem to display any kind of coherency when it comes to dealing with the pandemic?
Well, my book's mostly not about COVID-19. It was mostly written before. I do mention what's going on because it's obviously a big issue, but things are moving really fast. So that's not the main focus of my book. I want to make that clear first of all. But you're right, Desi, to say that the COVID-19 pandemic has shone a really unflattering spotlight on every leader around the world, and some have, in that spotlight, have done relatively well, some have done okay, and some have done very, very poorly, Donald Trump being an obvious example for all to see. So I think it is a difficult picture for Indonesia, let's be honest. Indonesia came into this crisis with a health system that was already really, really overstretched. So Indonesia has really low ratios of doctors and ICU beds per population compared to many other countries. And we also know there's a lot of financial stress on the health system too. Plus, the nature of Indonesia's economy makes it really difficult, for sure, to have the kind of lockdowns that they've had in Australia and some other developed countries, because so many people are working in the informal sector. And if you just shut things down, that is those people's rice bowl taken away from them. But I think it's clear that the communication from the start from the government was very unclear. And it's really not my criticism, but Indonesian epidemiologists, Indonesian scientists who've been on the front line of trying to encourage the government to take a clearer approach But I accept this is a really difficult crisis, and Jokowi is a leader who has always adapted over time to different challenges. So I think we have to accept that. But it's surely right for Indonesian scientists and epidemiologists to be pointing out some of the failures and some of the areas for improvement. And I think perhaps some of the government's irritation with that criticism, that's what I was talking about when I mentioned the lack of trust in civil society, that those voices should be listened to and learned from rather than necessarily seen as some sort of political issue for the government. But, no, none of us likes to hear criticism. That's a human weakness that we all have.
Let's highlight some of the contradictions that you mentioned in your book. Of course, as we in Indonesia, we're very aware of the government and, of course, of the president's shortcomings and the failures. And we're not short on criticizing him in that aspect. But I'm thinking of the kind of audience that you are appealing your book to and what they would get out of it. How Ben, highlight some of the contradictions, perhaps on economic issues, on political issues, and foreign policy issues, and how would that impact, for example, if the decision makers of Australia were to read your papers and use that as a kind of input from the Lowy Institute think tank? What would they get out of it?
Well, there's a few key things which I'd like to highlight. So on the economic front, which you mentioned, Desi, there's always been this great expectation that Indonesia will open up its economy to foreign investment, that it will liberalize. And the president has obviously, raised these expectations sometimes when he's visited these international business forums and talked about pushing the Indonesian economy to be more open and competitive. And Indonesia has had, like a lot of emerging countries, that need for foreign capital and foreign technology to drive growth and jobs creation since its foundation. But on the other hand, I think people outside the country often don't understand that economic liberalism and liberalism is in some sense a dirty word in Indonesia because of the reputation of the pain that people felt through the IMF restructuring program in 1998. But even again, going back to 1945, when understandably many of Indonesia's founders felt that it was economic liberalism that was really the foundation for the colonialism by which the Dutch exploited Indonesia and took its resources and abused its people and dominated its territory. So I want outsiders to understand that in Indonesia, liberalism, economic liberalism, isn't really necessarily seen as a good thing. It's seen as a bad thing, and that the Indonesian constitution and many Indonesian people do want to see a bigger role for the state in managing the economy. But I think that's often ill understood outside the country, and I think it's legitimate for Indonesia to want to do that, and people need to understand and hopefully try and find a better balance between this need for foreign investment and Indonesia's position to nationalize certain industries and to restrict foreign investment in certain sectors while allowing it in others. But I think the messaging hasn't always been very clear, and if you read the president's speeches to the Indonesian public, he talks much more about the kind of economic nationalist side of things. And to foreigners, much more about making Indonesia open and competitive. And I think a clearer picture of that for everyone would actually help to encourage investment because people need predictability. So I think that's one of the big contradictions I would talk about. On another one, on foreign policy, which you also mentioned, there's this great expectation in Australia, I think we see it in Washington as well, that Indonesia will step up and play a much bigger role in Asia's diplomacy and managing great power relations. But I think there's a failure to understand just how important the bebasan aktif policy is in Indonesia, and that really it's about, first and foremost, protecting Indonesia's internal security and trying to keep the country together, putting the focus really on driving the economic growth, driving job creation, which at the end of the day matters much more to Indonesian voters, if you look at survey data, than Indonesia playing a big diplomatic role for the sake of it. So again, I think that's something that's often not well understood outside the country. And my point isn't to say write Indonesia off, it's to say understand it's facing these deep challenges. And if you understand that and you can work within that, then outsiders in the Australian government, investors, will get much more out of their engagements with Indonesia if it's based on a clearer, deeper understanding of some of the challenges, which I say are totally understandable for a country that's 75 years young and come such a long way.
Okay, but Ben, another little break, but we still have a couple of segments to go. Tetaplah bersama kami. Insight with Desi Anwar akan segera kembali. Ya, Insight with Desi Anwar, saya ditemani oleh Ben Bland, penulis buku Man of Contradictions, Joko Widodo and the Struggle to Remake Indonesia. Dan Ben tersambung lewat Zoom, langsung dari Sydney. So, you highlighted two contradictions, the economic issues and foreign policy. By the way, Ben, we have just quite recently, actually, today, the Parliament has ratified the bill on omnibus law of job creation, and there's a lot of pushback because it's exactly what you're saying. It's opening up the country to foreign investors, and it will have a very negative impact on the environment and also the job security for particularly the low-wage workers in Indonesia. Just a quick thought, does that fit within your idea of this man of contradictions when it comes to, rushing this bill that a lot of people are still very much against?
I think it speaks to a certain extent to Jokowi's unpredictability as a leader. He's a man who can surprise, and sometimes, he moves quite incrementally. He wants to get everything lined up first before he pushes ahead, and sometimes he moves very quickly. And I think this is a case where he has surprised people, particularly, as you're saying, in the activists, in the human rights community, civil society organizations, and labor unions have been surprised by how fast and how hard he's pushed to get this bill through. But I think one of the challenges is, without having more consultation, is it necessarily going to be the kind of thing that the foreign investors want to see? I think there are some things in there that people will like, but we've already seen actually some criticism from some of the world's biggest international fund managers. These are companies that manage tens or hundreds of billions of dollars of investment around the world who are worried actually about the reduced environmental protections in this bill. But I think it speaks to Jokowi's drive to make the economy work better, to make business processes smoother, and to drive job creation. But I think one of the bigger challenges is really, at the end of the day, that most Indonesians aren't working in the formal employed sector. They're working informally. So the sorts of protections in the labor law and that may be affected by this actually don't apply to many Indonesians in any case. But I think ultimately it will come down to the implementation, right? I think that's the challenge, especially with an omnibus law. The first time this has been tried really recently, it's such a broad law with so many different presidential and ministerial regulations to follow. It's all going to be about those follow-up measures, and also how the bureaucracy, how the civil service, how the different tiers of central and local government implement this on the ground. Because I think a lot of policies in Indonesia are very aspirational. They have a really high goal, which is right. But the proof is always in the pudding, and that's where things have been difficult for this president and for previous presidents, inevitably, given the diverse nature of Indonesia, the different levels of government you have, and the ego sectoral, the competition between different ministries, which is, I think, challenging for anyone to manage.
Absolutely. Been there for the last couple of decades, and it's not going to go away. Horse trading, politicking, and all sorts of compromises on this. But just very quickly on the omnibus law, it's supposed to attract foreign investment, but if it's resulting in actually, foreign companies are actually thinking twice about coming to invest in Indonesia because of environmental issues, that's also not so well thought out. But just the economy you mentioned, and also the foreign policy, we know that this is a president who regards, like you said, he's not really stepping up onto the global stage, and he's made it very clear that it's, foreign, it's not 1,000 friends and 0 enemies, but it's more like friends with benefits, what's in it for us. So he's obviously prioritizing on domestic issues. But isn't that actually reflecting his consistency, if anything, Ben. He has come onto this job promising to, do something about the economy and infrastructure, and he's been sticking on this economic issue to, if anything, undermining all the other aspects, such as civil liberties and so on. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, even in the way he's handling COVID-19, it seems to be prioritizing more on the economic results or the economic effect as opposed to the toll on human lives and human health.
For sure. I'm not saying that everything the president does is contradictory, and I don't say that everything he does is inconsistent. I totally agree with you, and in fact, I argue in the book that Jokowi's view of the world, his view of leadership, is really shaped by building his own furniture business at a really tough time in Indonesia during the Suharto era, when it wasn't easy, for a man without, great connections politically to build his own business from scratch, and he did a great job. And I think that shaped how he sees things, and he has always had that focus on the economy. The contradiction I'm talking about more is, that between this sort of economic nationalist image that you read a lot when you read the Indonesian media and speeches in Indonesia, and the sort of the image of Indonesia opening up to the outside world that you hear outside. And I think there's a great contradiction between those two different views, and even as the policy is enacted. So on the one hand, we see a number of measures that seem to be designed to make it easier for foreign investors. On the other hand, the president has moved to make the role of state-owned enterprises much more important, which actually squeezes out the space for foreign investors. So that's the contradiction I'm talking about on the economy. I think the other challenge is kind of the instinctive nature of the president. He's a man who learns, both as a furniture maker and as a city mayor and governor of Jakarta, by seeing and doing, going to the ground, blusukan, seeing things with his own eyes. And I think that's harder to scale up when you're in the presidency. So there's definitely been a concern when you talk to economic policymakers about some of the way in which the policies are implemented. So the focus on the economy is clear, but we haven't always seen, the policies come out in the right way. And that's because Jokowi is also seeking, political settlement. He's seeking political stability, which often sort of works against having the sort of stability you really need in policy terms to drive the economic transformation we really want to see. So Jokowi did a great job in building infrastructure, for sure, in his first term, but he wasn't really able to get the GDP growth up from that 5% level, and certainly nowhere near the 7% a year level he wanted to see when he was first elected. And that's obviously before the coronavirus hit, which makes things even that much harder.
Just out of interest, I mean, you said that you interviewed him several times. You met him. How does he strike you as a person? Because what I don't get from the book is sort of is there a depth to this figure? Do you get a sense that he was giving you what you want to hear, or was he being honest? Was he being candid? And also, is there some sort of evolution? Obviously, from a furniture maker to a mayor and then to president, there has to be some kind of evolution, just simply because it's such a big job to feel. What's your sense of him as a man, Ben?
Well, it's really hard to get a handle on, and I did interview him several times over the years, which I was lucky to do, and enjoyed those encounters. I mean, I think it was those meetings that first made me want to write about Jokowi, because I just found it fascinating how this guy who came from nowhere, really, he didn't say much. He's not a man who gives great florid speeches, but he has this amazing connection with voters, which allowed him to get to the top of politics in Indonesia, defeating all these much more powerful, wealthier, better connected elite politicians. So I think that's what sucked me in. But actually I found in the interviews over the years that he sticks to the same messages, and obviously I'm not just interviewing him, but I'm reading and observing how he governs, and more importantly, I spent a lot of time talking to people who worked with him, to ministers, to advisors, to relawan, to other supporters, people in the media industry and across government. And I was really trying to sort of, if you like, measure, take the pulse from all these different audiences, and then I had my interviews and try and bring them together to paint a picture. And it's quite hard to grasp Jokowi the man. This wasn't an authorized biography. I didn't have, those hours and hours, weeks and weeks, months and months following her around or anything like that. And I think that's what the struggle for some of his advisors I got from them was that they're struggling to always predict what he wants to do. And I think he deliberately rules in this kind of unpredictable way because it keeps him powerful and no one knows exactly what he's going to do next. There's a certain canny political talent there. But yeah, I don't think I have like a great sense of Jokowi the man, but I think I was able to paint a good picture of Jokowi the leader.
Okay, we'll take another little break. Ben, we have one more segment, so don't go away. We'll be right back. Jadi jangan kemana-mana dulu. Insight with Desi Anwar akan segera kembali. Ya, masih bersama Insight with Desi Anwar. Kita sedang membahas buku Man of Contradictions, Joko Widodo and the Struggle to Remake Indonesia, karya Ben Bland dari Lowy Institute. Ben, contradictions in a positive light, but you also mentioned unpredictability, and you feel that Jokowi well enough to make an assessment of him. But would you also say that the contradictions or the unpredictability is a reflection perhaps of somebody, the furniture maker, the businessman, trying to grow into the job, navigating the complexities of Indonesian politics, which is vicious, full of politickings and backstabbing and so on and so forth. And he's just basically being pragmatic, see what works.
I think that's certainly right to an extent. And, we have to remember how quickly Jokowi rose. It was really only 2 years between him being mayor of Solo, a city of 500,000 people, and president of a country of 270 million people. So it was really a dramatic rise in a short period of time. And as I said earlier, Jokowi has adapted to a certain extent. And, he's gone from having a minority of the parliament behind him to having 3/4 of the parliamentarians in his governing coalition, which is really impressive. He's really sort of owned the political scene, as you said, over these much more powerful, experienced figures who, of course, are trying to manipulate him, to use him for their own advantage. So I think he has adapted, but what strikes me is, how much his communication style, his way of talking, the way he discusses things is still so similar to when he was a city mayor. And I think that's actually why I think a lot of Indonesians like him, because he does put things in clear, straightforward terms that they can understand. But yeah, for sure, as you rise higher up the tree, it's harder and harder to do things the same way you did before. And I think that is certainly one of the major challenges that he's faced. And as I said, he's adapted very, very well in terms of political stability to have such a powerful place now. But the challenge has been the policy side, I think, and has that necessarily followed through?
You said this is a political biography. Do you think Jokowi is a political man? Has he proven himself to be a man of politics, Ben, despite the fact that he showed little interest in politics in his early years?
Well, this is one of the many things that fascinated me about Jokowi, which I think is a contradiction, right? That he's not someone who ever expressed much outward interest in politics. I mean, in his own ghostwritten autobiography, he talks about when he was a student, he didn't really engage much in political discussions with other people at his university. He preferred climbing mountains and listening to heavy metal music. And yet he obviously has this deep ambition and self-confidence that he's been able to grow in over the years to rise to the presidency. So I think that is quite confusing and confounding in a sense, that this guy from simple origins who doesn't read political biographies himself. From what we know, he didn't dream of being president. He couldn't when he was a child, but something in him drove him to the top, and something in him made him able to get there. So I think he's, of course, been a brilliant politician. He's won these 2 great presidential victories. He's come from nowhere in such a short period of time. So for sure, he is a politician who will change the way things are done in Indonesia to a certain extent. We know that there are other local leaders, whether it's Ridwan Kamil or Ganjar Pranowo or others, who are looking to follow in his lead, showing that they can deliver results in local, directly elected positions as a way to drive themselves onto the national stage. And it was really Jokowi who laid out that pathway. The challenge, of course, and the tension is how much when you get to the top can you really change the system, or do you just become consumed by it?
Absolutely. Well, of course, here's the first, civil, an outsider, non-elitist Indonesian becoming the president of Indonesia. But Ben, I'd just like to quote something again from your book. The president is caught between the promise of democracy and the deep roots of authoritarianism in Indonesia. Now, also in the book, there's this mention of the king, is about Jokowi, and also that there is a mention of dynasty, and he's preparing his children, it seems, to follow his footsteps. Now, what would you like your audience to get from that statement? Of course, and Suharto is also mentioned, and Suharto was, of course, synonymous with authoritarianism, but he seemed to have aged well in history as he's also associated with stability and predictability, which is something that many Indonesians crave for at the moment. Your take, Ben?
Well, a lot of world leaders, from Obama to Malcolm Turnbull in Australia, have painted Indonesia as a beacon of democracy, and I just don't think it's a very helpful way to understand what's going on, because Indonesia is a unique country with a unique history. And I think there's been this tussle really since independence from the Netherlands between democracy and authoritarianism. There's been these debates over time between leaders and the political class over what's the most appropriate form of government for Indonesia. So I think we need to understand kind of the tensions that play out, the frustrations of civil society with what they see as sort of a crackdown on some government critics, and some of the pressures in this historical context. That's the message that I want people from outside to understand, because, as you say, for example, Suharto remains quite popular among Indonesians in a number of surveys, partly because of that sense that things were more predictable back in the day. Whether it's true or not, that's how a lot of people feel about things. At the same time, surveys show that Indonesians are by and large satisfied with democracy. But we do know, as I said, that there have been pressures, that minority groups, some activists feel that they're being squeezed. They feel that the space for public debate is under pressure. And I think we need to see that in the long history of Indonesia.
What I didn't see mentioned at all, and because this is unique to Indonesia, and democracy in Indonesia is quite unique because we have Pancasila, as you very well know, Ben, and that often jars with democracy if we are seeing democracy as the voice of the majority. And if going back to democracy, looking at what's happening in the world around us, with leaders and countries sort of backpedaling on democracy and trampling on rights, well, how would you rate, again from an outsider's perspective, how would you rate democracy really is in Indonesia? Is this something that the Australian government or your readers would need to worry about in Indonesia? We're at a crossroads of not exactly an unclear future where the country is going to go.
Well, I think it's something mostly for Indonesians to worry about or not worry about, because it's your country. But I think if you look at it in comparative context, Indonesia, I think, is far and away the strongest, most vibrant democracy in Southeast Asia. I mean, it was the openness of Indonesia that allowed me as a foreign journalist and a researcher to get to meet so many interesting people across your country, which was fantastic. That's not something you can do in a lot of other countries in Southeast Asia. Indonesia's elections, which I was lucky enough to witness on a number of occasions, are free and fair and hotly contested. And that's something that's so hard to get right for a country transitioning from military and authoritarian rule. I mean, just look at Myanmar, look at Thailand, and how far they've sort of slid back, in Thailand's case, constantly toing and froing with all these coups. So I think Indonesia has done a great job, but I think in the last few years, things have come under pressure. And democracy isn't just something that, you get through elections. It's also about democratic practice, democratic principles, and it's something we all need to work at. In Australia, in the United Kingdom, where I'm originally from. Certainly, if we look to the United States now, this is something that societies need to work on with political parties, with the media, and it's not easy to get right, and it takes a long time. So I think Indonesia's done remarkably well in the 22 years since Reformasi, but there's obviously a lot of work that needs to go coming forward. And at the end of the day, it's up to the Indonesian voters to choose the leaders they want to take themselves forward. The challenge is, of course, that the political parties and the elites have a tight hold, in some senses, on power. And elections are the way, that people have this chance to have their say. So I think that power play between the powerful and the people will continue in the future. And I think Indonesia, in the long context of its history, is certainly moving in the right direction, but it's never smooth for any country. Certainly when you're so big and so diverse, it makes it much, much harder.
So Indonesia is moving in the right direction, you said. So the next 3 years is this sort of authoritarianism that you mentioned in the book, and the reference to, notice also the comparison with Suharto. This is not something that, to be worried about, or?
I think it's clear from what you were saying earlier about the omnibus law that people in civil society in Indonesia are worried. There's no doubt about that, and there have been several concerning issues. But I think it depends on the lens you look at. If you compare things with 1993, the Indonesians today have far more freedom to speak their minds. The Indonesian journalists have more ability to write about and communicate about what they want. The researchers have the opportunity to say the things they want to say, far, far more than in those days. So I think it's about how you measure it. So in the long picture, Indonesia is moving in the right direction. But I think it's clear that in the last few years there have been some pressures. And we also know that around the world, the pandemic has also added to this pressure in a sense, because you have this fundamental debate between control of the virus and control of people's lives, and allowing people more freedom, which can not necessarily be the right way to tackle the virus, and that's a difficult balance to get right. So I think that whole environment and the fact that Indonesia's economy is going to face a big challenge too, that obviously adds to these pressures. But I think, as I say, we have to acknowledge just how hard it is for countries to transition out of decades of military rule. So many other countries that have tried have failed spectacularly. Indonesia has really come a long way. And as I'm sure many Indonesians think, there's a lot of work that they want to see from their government to get the sort of leadership and the sort of regulations, the sort of politicians and the sort of democracy they want to see. That's going to take work, but things have come a long way in the right direction.
Thank you very much for your insight, and also we greatly appreciate you writing about Indonesia. I mean, if it leads to a much greater understanding between Indonesia and Australia, of course. I mean, we're neighbors, but sometimes things get lost in translation, and it's good that the more people, the more Australians know and understand and are more interested about Indonesia, it can only be for the better. Thank you again once for your insight, and Ben, stay safe and stay healthy.
Thanks so much.
Okay,
Thanks,
bye-bye.
Desi.
Ya, demikian Insight with Desi Anwar kali ini dengan Ben Bland mengenai bukunya. Anda juga dapat menyaksikan tayangan ini di cnnindonesia.com dan juga di YouTube CNN Indonesia Insight with Desi Anwar. Sampai jumpa, dan jangan lupa stay safe ya, pakai masker, jaga jarak, sering cuci tangan, hindari kerumunan, dan bye-bye.